Well, the tide has just pulled back from a flat grey shore. The water is warmer than it should be. Everything here, the colour of the mud, the thickness of the air, the way the light diffuses through a sky still faintly hazed with volcanic particulate, is slightly wrong by any standard a human observer would recognise. This is not a familiar world. This is Earth, but an Earth so remote from the one we inhabit that calling it by the same name almost requires a deliberate act of imagination. A small archosaur moves along the tide line. It is perhaps 40 centimetres from snout to tail, roughly the size of a domestic cat, though built nothing like one. Its legs are tucked partway beneath its body in a posture that is neither quite reptilian nor quite anything that will exist 200 million years from now. It moves carefully, testing the wet sediment with each step, pausing near a cluster of low dome-shaped stromatolites, bacterial mats that have been building these structures for 3 billion years and will continue doing so long after this animal's lineage has branched and transformed beyond recognition. The archosaur finds something worth eating near the base of one of the mats. It eats. The sky above is overcast and close. The air smells of sulphur and brine, and beneath that, something organic and pervasive, the smell of a world still rebuilding itself after catastrophe. What happened here, in the tens of millions of years before this moment, was the largest mass extinction this planet has ever experienced. The Permian-Triassic extinction event, which reached its acute phase roughly 252 million years ago, eliminated something in the range of 90 to 96% of all marine species and approximately 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. The world this archosaur moves through is a world that is only beginning to fill back in. The niches are empty, the ecosystems are thin, the food webs are simplified. Life is here, but it is sparse, and it is cautious, and it is exploratory in the way that life always is when the pressure has briefly lifted, and the available space suddenly vastly exceeds the available organisms. This is roughly the period we're concerned with tonight, the Triassic, the early and middle Triassic in particular, and it is here, in this strange, recovering, half-empty world, that one of the most formally interesting scientific thought experiments of the past decade places its central question: the Silurian hypothesis. The name sounds like the title of a science fiction novel, and that association is not entirely accidental. It borrows from a fictional alien race, the Silurians of the British television series Doctor Who. Reptilian beings who ruled Earth before the emergence of humanity and retreated underground when they sensed catastrophe approaching. But the hypothesis itself, as it was formally articulated, is not fiction. It is a peer-reviewed scientific paper published in 2019 in the International Journal of Astrobiology, authored by Gavin Schmidt, who directs NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and Adam Frank, an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester. What Schmidt and Frank asked was not whether lizard people once lived underground. What they asked was something considerably more precise and considerably more unsettling. They asked, if an industrial civilization had existed on Earth before the age of humans, would we be able to detect it? That question is the engine of everything that follows tonight. The archosaur by the Triassic shore has no awareness of the question. It moves on, leaving a brief trail of three-toed impressions in the grey mud before the next wave erases them. That is exactly the point. Traces erase, time compresses, rock cycles consume evidence. 250 million years is not merely a long time in the way that a century or a millennium is a long time. It is a span so vast that the ocean floors of the early Triassic no longer exist. They have been subducted, dragged down into the mantle by the movement of tectonic plates, melted and recycled. The continents themselves bore a different configuration. What is now North America was pressed against what is now Europe and Africa in the single supercontinent called Pangaea, and Pangaea itself was in the process of beginning to fracture during the Triassic. The geography, the chemistry, the biology, the atmospheric composition, all of it was different enough that a traveller from our time arriving there would need oxygen equipment and would need to reconcile themselves to a sky that held more carbon dioxide and a pressure slightly higher than today's. Against that backdrop of radical difference and radical time depth, the Silurian hypothesis invites us to ask a question that the geological record may simply be incapable of answering with certainty, not because the question is bad science, but because the record itself has limits, and understanding those limits, understanding precisely what 250 million years of Earth history does to physical evidence, is the real intellectual core of tonight's documentary. We will stay close to the science, we will stay close to the geology, we will walk through the Triassic, the Permian, the Deep Paleozoic, and the processes by which the Earth obliterates its own past, and we will ask honestly what could survive, what cannot survive, and what that means for the way we think about deep time and the possibility of civilizations within it. This is a documentary made for listening. The pace is slow by design. The information is real. The science cited is published and verifiable. If you find yourself drifting towards sleep, that is not a failure. It is the format working as intended. Let the geology wash over you. Let the deep time do what deep time does. The Permian extinction is the right place to begin. Not because any civilization is proposed to have existed during the Permian. The Silurian hypothesis is agnostic about timing and does not specify a particular geological period for any hypothetical prior civilization. But because the Permian-Triassic boundary is one of the most extensively studied stratigraphic horizons in the entire geological record, and studying it teaches us something fundamental about how information survives or fails to survive across geological time. The boundary itself is visible in the rock. There are places in the world, sections of exposed cliff face in China, in Italy, in South Africa, in the Canadian Arctic, where you can run your finger along a thin layer of sediment and know that above your fingertip is the Triassic and below it is the Permian. That boundary layer, sometimes called the PTB in the literature, is chemically and isotopically strange. The carbon isotope ratio shifts abruptly across it. Oxygen isotopes record a rapid warming. Sulfur isotopes record ocean anoxia, zones of water depleted of oxygen, hostile to most animal life. The layer contains abundant fungal spores, which are the microscopic signature of mass death on land, because fungi are the organisms that consume dead organic matter when the organisms that normally recycle it have themselves died off. All of that chemical and isotopic signature is preserved. 252 million years later, we can read the chemistry of a catastrophe. This is what the geological record can do at its best. It preserves ratios, it preserves proportions, it preserves the chemical fingerprints of events. What it struggles to preserve, and this distinction is the foundation of the Silurian hypothesis, is physical structure, the actual shapes of things, the actual material of manufactured objects, the actual molecular complexity of technology. The archosaur's three-toed footprints in the Triassic mud will not survive 250 million years unless they are buried quickly, in exactly the right sedimentary conditions, in a basin that remains geologically stable enough to preserve the layering, and in a location that has not since been subducted, eroded, metamorphosed, or uplifted and worn away. Most footprints don't make it. Most organisms don't make it. The fossil record, for all its richness, represents a vanishingly small fraction of the life that has actually existed on this planet. Estimates vary by methodology, but something in the range of less than 1% of all species that have ever lived have left any fossil trace at all, and that fraction shrinks further when you consider that most of those traces are shells and teeth and bones, the hard mineralized parts of organisms. Soft tissue almost never fossilizes. Behavior almost never fossilizes. Technology, if you could call it that in any biological sense, almost never fossilizes. This is the geological reality that the Silurian hypothesis sits inside, and it is a reality worth inhabiting carefully, slowly, because it reframes the question entirely. The question is not, did a civilization exist? The question is, given what we know about geological preservation, what would we expect to find if one had existed, and are we looking for the right things? That reframing is what makes Schmidt and Frank's paper genuinely interesting rather than merely speculative. They are not arguing that a prior civilization did exist. They are examining the conditions under which one could have existed without leaving a trace we would recognize, or could have left traces so subtle that we might be misreading them or attributing them to entirely natural processes, because we have no conceptual framework that tells us what industrial-scale interference in planetary chemistry looks like when viewed from 250 million years of distance. The Triassic world outside is still quiet. The archosaur has moved on. The stromatolites grow at their imperceptible pace, adding perhaps 0.5 millimeter per year to their domed surfaces, as they have for 3 billion years. The waves come in and go out. The sky is the same overcast pale grey it has been all morning. In this recovering world, something is beginning. The dinosaurs are not yet here. The earliest unambiguous dinosaurs appear in the fossil record roughly 230 to 235 million years ago, well into the Middle Triassic. But the lineages that will produce them are already moving through this landscape, already differentiated enough from the other archosaurs to be recognisably on their own path. The world is sorting itself. The empty niches are beginning to fill, slowly and unevenly, with organisms that are in the process of becoming something the world has never seen before. That process, the post-extinction radiation, the filling of empty ecological space with new forms, is one of the most powerful forces in evolutionary biology. It happened after the Permian extinction. It happened after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction 66 million years ago. It will, statistically speaking, happen again, and it raises a question that the Silurian hypothesis only touches on obliquely, but that the geological record makes almost impossible to avoid. How many times has this planet undergone radical restructuring, radical emptying, radical refilling in its 4.5 billion year history? And in each of those vast intervals between catastrophes, intervals that can run to tens of millions of years of relative stability, what had time to develop, to diversify, to become complex before the next reset arrived? The Permian extinction was not the first. Before it came the late Devonian extinction, roughly 375 million years ago. Before that, the Endordovian extinction, roughly 445 million years ago. And before that, going further back into the Cambrian and the Precambrian, there are chemical and isotopic signatures in the rock that suggest biological crises of various scales that we're still working to fully characterize. Each of those boundaries is a potential chapter break in the story of complex life on Earth, and each of those chapters lasted long enough, in principle, for something unexpected to happen. That is where we are at the end of this opening section, not with an answer, with a properly framed question, and a sense of the scale of time inside which the question lives. The geological record is not a library. That comparison is tempting and almost universally made, but it is wrong in a way that matters. A library is organised. A library is intentional. A library preserves what someone decided was worth preserving, in a medium chosen for durability, in a structure built to resist time. The geological record is none of those things. It is the accidental residue of processes that had no interest in preservation whatsoever. Sedimentation, burial, compression, lithification, uplift, erosion, subduction. These are not archival processes. They are geological processes, and preservation is their occasional and unintended side effect, not their purpose. Understanding this distinction is not a minor technical point. It is the foundation on which the entire Silurian hypothesis rests, and it is the reason the hypothesis is scientifically serious rather than merely imaginative. If the geological record were a complete archive, the question would answer itself almost immediately. Either the evidence is there or it is not. But the geological record is not complete. It is not even close to complete. It is a set of fragments, biased towards certain environments, certain chemistries, certain timescales, and systematically silent about vast categories of information that were never, under any realistic conditions, going to be preserved. To understand how deep that silence goes, consider what happens to a city. Not an ancient city, a modern one. Take a city of moderate size, perhaps 1 million inhabitants, with the full suite of what we would call industrial infrastructure. Roads paved with asphalt and concrete, buildings of steel and glass and fired brick, underground networks of pipes and cables, plastics in every form imaginable, electronics, manufactured chemicals distributed through the soil and water and atmosphere, landfills packed with compressed waste. Now remove the inhabitants, stop all maintenance, and then wait. The first century is dramatic. Vegetation reclaims the streets. Roots fracture the pavement. Water infiltrates the buildings. Steel corrodes. Glass shatters under thermal expansion and contraction. The organic materials, wood, fabric, rubber, decompose relatively quickly. Within 500 years, most surface structures have collapsed. Within a few thousand years, the skyline is gone. The roads are buried under accumulating organic matter and wind-blown sediment. The steel is rust, and the rust is dispersing into the surrounding soil as iron oxides. Within 100,000 years, the above-ground signature of that city is largely gone from the visible landscape. What remains is underground. compressed layers of anomalous material in the sediment, elevated concentrations of certain metals, unusual isotopic ratios, perhaps traces of synthetic organic compounds if the local chemistry is right for preservation. The concrete foundations may persist as anomalous hard layers in the stratigraphy. The landfill may show as a zone of chemically distinct sediment. But the recognizable shape of anything, a building, a road, a manufactured object, is almost certainly gone. Now extend the timescale to 1 million years. The region may have been glaciated, which would have scraped and reworked the upper layers of sediment entirely. Or it may have been tectonically active, burying the site under meters of new material, or uplifting and eroding it. The underground water chemistry may have dissolved the concrete, oxidized the remaining metals, broken down the synthetic polymers into their constituent organic molecules, which then dispersed into the surrounding sediment and became indistinguishable from natural organic material. At 10 million years, even the chemical signatures are attenuating. The isotopic anomalies are being diluted by mixing. The elevated metal concentrations are spreading through the sediment column. What was a city is now, at most, a subtle geochemical whisper in a rock layer. If that layer has survived at all, if it has not been subducted, or eroded, or metamorphosed beyond recognition. At 100 million years, the rock that contains the former city, if it still exists, is probably a sedimentary unit whose origin no geologist would think to question. It might be a shale, or a limestone, or a sandstone, depending on the depositional environment. The anomalies, if they persist at all, might be misread as volcanic in origin, or diagenetic, or simply as local geochemical variation with no anthropogenic explanation. Because the concept of an anthropogenic explanation at that time, depth would not occur to the geologist studying the sample. At 250 million years, the timescale of the early Triassic, the former city is almost certainly not detectable by any method currently available to us. Not because we lack the technology, because the signal has been erased by the geological processes that have acted on that rock through 250 million years of Earth history. This is what Schmidt and Frank mean when they describe the problem of detectability. It is not a problem of instrumentation, it is a problem of signal persistence, and it is a problem that applies symmetrically. If we cannot detect a prior civilization, then a civilization existing 250 million years from now would face the same difficulty trying to detect us. The geological record of the Anthropocene, the geological record of the industrial civilization we have built over the past 2 centuries, will be preserved, if at all, as a thin layer of anomalous chemistry in the rock. Elevated carbon, shifted isotopes, traces of synthetic compounds, microplastics distributed globally through the sediment. The physical structures, the cities, the roads, the satellites, these will be gone. What remains will be chemical. That insight is clarifying in more than one direction. It tells us something about what to look for in the ancient record if we are taking the Silurian hypothesis seriously. And it tells us something about our own footprint and how it will look to anyone reading the rock millions of years from now. The specific chemical signatures that Schmidt and Frank identify as potentially detectable across very long timescales include several that are worth examining in some detail. The first and most discussed is the carbon isotope record. Industrial civilization burns fossil fuels at a rate that is releasing carbon stored over hundreds of millions of years back into the atmosphere in a geologically instantaneous pulse, a matter of centuries, which is, in geological terms, essentially a single point in time. That pulse of isotopically light carbon, carbon depleted in the heavier carbon-13 isotope because it derives from ancient organic matter, produces a measurable shift in the carbon isotope ratio of sediments deposited during the event. This kind of shift has a name in geology. It is called a carbon isotope excursion, or CIE. Carbon isotope excursions are not unique to industrial civilization. They are recorded throughout the geological column, associated with volcanic eruptions, with large igneous provinces releasing enormous volumes of carbon dioxide, with ocean anoxic events, with the decomposition of methane hydrates on the seafloor. The Permian-Triassic boundary is itself marked by a dramatic negative carbon isotope excursion. So is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, roughly 56 million years ago, when global temperatures spiked by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius over a geologically brief interval. So are several other boundaries and events throughout Earth history. What that means is that if a prior industrial civilization had burned fossil fuels and produced a carbon isotope excursion in the geological record, we might already have that excursion in our data, and we might be interpreting it as volcanic, or as a methane hydrate release, or as some other purely natural mechanism, because those are the interpretations that fit within the framework we bring to the data. We are not looking for civilizations in the rock record, we are looking for geological processes, and those two interpretive frameworks can produce the same chemical signature. This is not an argument that any known carbon isotope excursion was caused by an industrial civilization. It is not even a minority scientific position. What it is, more precisely, is an acknowledgement that our interpretive tools are calibrated for natural processes, and that if a non-natural process produced a signal indistinguishable from a natural one, we would classify it as natural. The categories we use determine what we see. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum offers the closest natural analogue to what an industrial carbon pulse might look like in the rock. The PTM, as it is known, involved the release of somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 billion metric tons of carbon into the atmosphere and ocean over a period estimated at between 20,000 and 200,000 years. Global temperatures rose, ocean chemistry changed, species migrated toward the poles, some went extinct, others diversified rapidly, and then, over the following 100,000 to 200,000 years, the carbon was drawn back down by natural processes, silicate weathering, biological uptake, ocean chemistry, and conditions gradually returned to something resembling the baseline. The PETM is visible in the sediment record as a layer of isotopically light carbon, thermally altered sediment and faunal change. It is one of the most intensively studied geological events of the Cenozoic. And what it demonstrates, among other things, is that the Earth system has a recovery mechanism, a long-term carbon cycle that absorbs perturbations, though on timescales of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. An industrial civilization that burned its fossil fuels and then disappeared, through extinction, through voluntary cessation, through catastrophic collapse, would leave a carbon isotope anomaly in the rock. That anomaly would be real, and depending on its magnitude and duration, it might be distinguishable from volcanic or hydrothermal sources, or it might not. The second category of chemical signature that persists across long timescales is the record of certain metals. Industrial activity concentrates metals in ways that natural processes do not. Lead, cadmium, mercury, arsenic, zinc. These are mobilized by smelting and industrial processing and distributed through the atmosphere and waterways in patterns and concentrations that have no exact natural analogue. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve records of atmospheric lead going back several 100,000 years, and the industrial signature of the past 2 centuries is clearly elevated above the natural background. That elevated signal would not survive in ice. Ice doesn't last millions of years, but it would survive as an anomaly in lake sediments, in marine sediments, potentially in certain types of chemical sedimentary rock. The third category is more speculative but worth noting. Certain synthetic organic compounds, particularly some of the more chemically stable ones, might persist in sedimentary rock over very long timescales under the right conditions. This is genuinely uncertain. Most organic compounds break down, but some, particularly those with unusual molecular structures not found in nature, might leave traces in the organic geochemistry of ancient sediments. The technical field that studies this is called organic geochemistry, and its practitioners are skilled at reading the molecular remnants of ancient life from rock samples. Whether they could read the remnants of manufactured chemistry from rock 250 million years old is an open question, and an honest one. What the Triassic world outside our earlier scene cannot tell us, from its position 250 million years in the past, is whether any of these signatures exist within its own stratigraphy waiting to be found, misidentified, or correctly identified as something unexpected. The rock of the early Triassic is out there. It exists in outcrop in dozens of places around the world, and it exists as core samples drilled from sedimentary basins. Geochemists study it routinely. They are studying it for the signatures of the Permian extinction, for the recovery of the carbon cycle, for the rediversification of marine life. They are not studying it for the signatures of prior civilizations, because that is not a hypothesis that sits within the normal working framework of stratigraphy. And that, precisely, is the epistemological point that Schmidt and Frank are making. The absence of a search is not the same as the absence of a signal, We have not looked for this. We are not equipped, conceptually or institutionally, to look for this in the way that the hypothesis would require. The geological community has a framework for interpreting chemical anomalies in ancient rock. That framework does not include industrial civilization as a possible cause, because industrial civilization is, in our understanding, a recent and unique phenomenon. But the framework itself is a choice, and any framework that excludes a possibility a priori cannot detect that possibility, even if the evidence for it is present. This is not a conspiracy. It is not negligence. It is how science works. You build interpretive models from the data you have and the causes you know to exist. When a new cause is proposed, the old data must be re-examined with new eyes. That re-examination has not happened systematically for the Silurian hypothesis, not because scientists are hiding something, but because the hypothesis is new, its proponents are a small number of researchers, and the interpretive tools required to test it rigorously are still being defined. The Triassic shore from our opening scene is still there, in a sense. The rock that formed from that mud is still there. It is a grey shale somewhere in a sedimentary basin, possibly in China, possibly in the Alps, possibly in the American Southwest. It has been through 250 million years of burial, heating, compression, and in some places partial metamorphism. If anything walked along that shore with the archosaur, anything that manufactured, that processed materials, that altered the local chemistry in systematic ways, the evidence of that activity is now either erased entirely or compressed into a geochemical whisper that we are reading as something else entirely, or still present and waiting for someone to ask the right question of the right rock sample. That is a genuine scientific uncertainty, not a comfortable one, but a genuine one. 450 million years ago, the world looked nothing like the one the Triassic archosaur inhabited. The continents were in different positions, the atmosphere held different proportions of gases, the oceans were shallower in some places and deeper in others, and they were full of organisms that have no living relatives, and that we know only as impressions and mineralized fragments in Ordovician limestone. The land was largely bare of complex life. Plants had not yet developed the wood-forming tissues that would eventually produce forests. Insects did not exist. The vertebrates that existed were entirely aquatic, jawless, armoured fish moving through shallow marine environments that bore no resemblance to any modern ecosystem. This is the Ordovician period, and the Ordovician matters to the Silurian hypothesis, not because the hypothesis takes its name from the period that immediately follows it, the Silurian, which ran from approximately 444 million to 419 million years ago, but because the Ordovician-Silurian boundary is defined by one of the 5 great mass extinctions in Earth history, an extinction that wiped out somewhere between 60 and 85% of all marine species in 2 distinct pulses over a period of roughly 1 million years. An extinction driven, in the current scientific consensus, by a rapid glaciation of the southern supercontinent Gondwana, which locked enormous quantities of water in ice sheets, dropped sea levels dramatically, and cooled the global ocean to temperatures that the organisms adapted to warm Ordovician seas could not survive. After that extinction, the Silurian began, and the Silurian is quieter than most of the periods surrounding it. Life recovered. Coral reefs rebuilt themselves. Fish diversified. The first vascular plants appeared on land, simple, rootless, leafless structures no more than a few centimeters tall, colonizing the margins of wet coastal environments with a tentativeness that seems almost tentative only in retrospect, because those first land plants were doing something no organism had ever done before, making the terrestrial surface biologically habitable in a systematic way. The Silurian lasted approximately 25 million years. It was not a period of dramatic biological innovation compared to what came before and after. It was a period of recovery and gradual diversification. The choice of the name Silurian hypothesis by Schmidt and Frank is explicitly a nod to the science fiction tradition, and they acknowledge it directly in their paper. They are not proposing that a Silurian civilization existed during the Silurian period. The name is a frame, a reference point, a way of anchoring an abstract possibility in something a reader might already have encountered. What the hypothesis actually proposes is timescale agnostic. It asks whether any prior civilization, at any point in Earth's 4.5 billion year history, could have existed without leaving detectable evidence. The Silurian period, by historical accident of naming conventions within a British television programme, lent its name to the question. The question itself is not confined to that period, but the question does have a practical lower bound in time. For a civilization to have existed in any sense that even approaches what we mean by the word, there must have been organisms of sufficient cognitive complexity to develop technology, social organisation, and cumulative knowledge transfer. That requirement constrains us to the period after the Cambrian explosion, the rapid diversification of complex animal body plans that began roughly 540 million years ago. Before the Cambrian explosion, the organisms present on Earth were primarily microbial. There were multicellular animals in the late Precambrian, in the Ediacaran period, but they were soft-bodied, sessile or slow-moving, and showed no neurological complexity that would form any plausible foundation for cognition. So the window of time within which the Silurian hypothesis is practically interesting runs from roughly 500 million years ago to approximately 300,000 years ago, which is approximately when the first anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record. That is a window of nearly 500 million years. Within that window, there have been at least 5 major mass extinctions, each of which reset the evolutionary trajectory of life on Earth. Between those extinctions, there were intervals of relative stability lasting tens of millions of years. The question then becomes, within those stable intervals, did any lineage develop the kind of complexity that could have led to something we would recognize in retrospect as civilizational? The answer that mainstream evolutionary biology gives is no. Not because the question has been rigorously tested, but because the standard model of evolutionary biology does not include a teleological drive toward intelligence. Evolution does not aim at complexity. It selects for reproductive fitness in a given environment. Intelligence, or more precisely the specific kind of social and technological intelligence that characterizes human civilization, appears in the record as a singular and contingent development, one path among many that the vertebrate lineage could have taken after the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, and a path that happened to be taken by one particular primate lineage in sub-Saharan Africa over the past 2 to 3 million years. From this perspective, the emergence of technological civilization is improbable not because it requires anything supernatural, but because it requires an extraordinarily specific combination of factors: sufficient cognitive complexity, social living, manipulative appendages capable of fine motor control, a stable enough climate to permit the accumulation of surplus food, and the specialization of labor, and enough time in that stable environment for cumulative cultural knowledge to build on itself, generation after generation. The argument from mainstream evolutionary biology is that the intersection of all those factors, at the right time and in the right sequence, is rare. Perhaps uniquely rare on this planet. But that argument, however well supported by what we know about evolutionary history, contains an assumption that is worth examining carefully. The assumption is that we would know if a prior lineage had developed those characteristics, and that assumption is precisely what the Silurian hypothesis places under pressure. Consider the non-avian dinosaurs. They dominated terrestrial ecosystems for approximately 165 million years. 165 million years is a span of time so vast that it contains the entirety of primate evolution many times over. The dinosaur lineage was diverse, widespread, and in many respects successful beyond anything the mammalian lineage has yet achieved in terms of raw duration. Within that lineage, there were animals of varying body sizes, dietary strategies, social behaviors, and neurological complexity. Some of the later theropod dinosaurs, the group that includes the ancestors of modern birds, show evidence of relatively enlarged brains compared to their body size, advanced social behavior, parental care of offspring, and in some cases what appear to be rudimentary forms of play behavior. None of this is a claim that any dinosaur species was intelligent in a human sense. The neurological gap between even the most cognitively complex non-avian dinosaur and a human being is enormous, and the fossil record provides no evidence of anything approaching technology or symbolic thought in any dinosaur lineage. But the thought experiment is instructive. Given 165 million years, given a lineage already showing trajectory toward greater neural complexity, what might have happened if the asteroid had not arrived 66 million years ago? This is not a scientific question in any strict sense. It is speculative by definition, but it illustrates the contingency of the outcome we're used to calling inevitable. The asteroid arrived. The non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. The mammals that survived were small and generalist and had been suppressed for 100 million years under dinosaur dominance, and from those survivors, 66 million years of evolution eventually produced us. Remove the asteroid, and that sequence of events does not occur. What occurs instead is unknowable, but one possibility, not the only possibility, but a possibility, is that a lineage with already increasing neural complexity continues on that trajectory for millions or tens of millions of years more, and develops something that, at least in functional terms, resembles what we call intelligence. The geological record of such a lineage, if it had remained biological rather than technological, would be essentially indistinguishable from the record we already have. Cognitive complexity leaves almost no direct fossil signature. Social behaviour leaves almost no direct fossil signature. The things that would mark a lineage as cognitively sophisticated, the patterns of association, the evidence of learning, the structure of group behaviour, are preserved only in the rarest and most fortunate taphonomic circumstances, and even then only as indirect inferences from anatomy. Now consider the harder version of the thought experiment. Not a cognitively complex dinosaur lineage that remained biological, but one that developed, over sufficient time, what we would call technology. The manufacture of tools, the controlled use of fire, the processing of materials. What would survive of that in the rock record 66 million years later? The tools themselves, if made of stone, might survive. Stone tools are among the most durable objects that any organism can produce, and they are recognizable as manufactured objects because they bear the specific kinds of conchoidal fracture and edge modification that result from intentional napping rather than random mechanical stress. If a pre-human species had made stone tools 66 million years ago, we might find them. The oldest stone tools we know of, attributed to the genus Homo or its immediate precursors, date to approximately 3.3 million years ago, from a site in Kenya. They are recognizable as tools. They have survived millions of years. Stone tools of comparable antiquity, if they existed, might persist. But the next step, fire, and the chemistry fire enables, is much harder. Hearths leave ash and charcoal and thermally altered sediment. Over millions of years, those signatures attenuate. Over tens of millions of years, they become essentially undetectable, except in the most exceptionally preserved deposits. Over 66 million years or more, the probability of survival drops to near zero for any specific locality, and the processed materials that fire enables, ceramics, metals, glass, begin their own long journey through dissolution and diagenesis, losing first their form, then their composition, then their isotopic signature, in a sequence that depends on the local geochemical environment and the duration of burial. What survives, if anything does, is the planetary chemistry, the atmospheric signal of prolonged burning, the sedimentary signal of metal concentration, the isotopic signal of rapid carbon release. These are the signals that persist longest because they are not dependent on the survival of any individual object or deposit. They are distributed globally through the atmosphere and ocean and sediment, and they are readable, in principle, from any well-preserved sedimentary section of the right age. The Triassic boundary sections that geochemists study with such care are exactly the kind of sedimentary sections that would contain those signals if they existed. The scientists studying those sections are extraordinarily skilled at reading subtle, chemical variations in ancient rock. They would see an anomalous carbon isotope excursion. They would see elevated metal concentrations. They would see unusual organic geochemical signatures. Whether they would interpret those anomalies as evidence of a prior civilization, rather than as evidence of volcanic activity, or hydrothermal circulation, or an unusual biological event, is a different question entirely. And it is ultimately a question about interpretive frameworks, rather than about instrumentation. The rock does not come with labels, the rock comes with chemistry. And chemistry is ambiguous. It requires interpretation, and interpretation requires a framework. And the framework we bring to ancient rock does not currently include prior civilizations as a category of explanation. The Silurian period itself, the actual Silurian, the geological period from 444 to 419 million years ago, was a time of warm, shallow seas, widespread coral reefs, and a terrestrial environment being slowly colonized by the earliest vascular plants and the first terrestrial arthropods. The The animals in those Silurian seas were extraordinary by any measure. Sea scorpions, called eurypterids, that reached lengths of 2.5 meters. Jawless fish experimenting with different forms of armor and sensory organ. The earliest jawed fish, still small and marginal, but carrying within their lineage the entire future of vertebrate evolution on land and in the air. None of those organisms were on any obvious trajectory toward technological civilization. The eurypterids, despite their impressive size, had nervous systems organized around sensory detection and predation, not around abstract cognition. The early fish had the beginnings of the neural architecture that would eventually, hundreds of millions of years later, produce the mammalian cortex. But they were hundreds of millions of years away from any of the conditions that would allow that architecture to develop toward anything resembling intelligence. The Silurian, in this sense, is an honest answer to its own hypothesis. The period from which the hypothesis takes its name was not, by any assessment currently available to us, a period of civilizational possibility. It was a period of evolutionary foundation laying. The lineages present in Silurian seas were doing the slow, non-directional work of diversification that evolution always does, not moving toward intelligence, not moving toward technology, simply responding to selection pressures in a world that had no category for either of those things. And yet the name holds. Because the question the hypothesis asks is not confined to the Silurian. It is a question about all of deep time, about the full span of complex life on Earth, about every stable interval between the extinctions, about every lineage that had millions of years and a trajectory toward complexity, and then was erased by a catastrophe that left the rock changed but the organisms gone. The Silurian is the frame. The question is larger than the frame. The Permian period lasted approximately 47 million years, from roughly 299 million to 252 million years ago. It is a period that does not get the attention it deserves in popular accounts of Earth history, partly because it ends in catastrophe so total that the catastrophe tends to overshadow everything that preceded it, and partly because the organisms that lived during the Permian are less visually arresting than the dinosaurs that followed them. They are not the creatures that ended up on the walls of children's bedrooms or in the glass cases of natural history museums. They are strange, and their strangeness is of a kind that requires some patience to appreciate. The dominant large vertebrates of the Permian were not dinosaurs, and they were not reptiles in the way we normally use that word. They were synapsids. The synapsids are the lineage to which all mammals belong, and the Permian was their world in a way that no subsequent period has been. Because after the Permian extinction, the synapsids were reduced to a handful of small, generalist survivors from which the entire mammalian lineage descended. But before the extinction, the synapsids were diverse, widespread, and ecologically dominant across the terrestrial environments of Pangaea. Among the Permian synapsids, the descendants are perhaps the most ecologically significant. They were herbivores, most of them, with a body plan that ranged from small burrowing forms the size of a rabbit to large grazing animals that approached the size of a modern hippopotamus. They had a beak, like a turtle, but also retained 2 prominent canine teeth, which gave them their name, 2 dog teeth. They moved through the Permian landscape in large numbers, grazing on the vegetation of a world that was already somewhat drier and more seasonal than the lush carboniferous forests that had preceded it. Some dicynodont species appear to have been social. Some show evidence of burrowing behaviour, which may have been a response to seasonal aridity. Their bones are found in bone beds, accumulations of many individuals in a single deposit, suggesting that they moved in groups and that mortality events sometimes affected many animals simultaneously. The descendants are not candidates for intelligence in any meaningful sense. Their brains, as inferred from endocasts, the natural or artificial casts of the interior of the skull cavity, were small relative to body size by mammalian standards, organised primarily around olfaction and basic sensory processing, with little of the cortical expansion that characterises cognitively complex mammals. They were successful ecological generalists, but there is nothing in their anatomy or their trace fossil record that suggests anything beyond the behavioural complexity typical of a large herbivorous vertebrate in any period of Earth history. But the therapsids more broadly, the larger group that includes the dicynodonts, and whose name means beast-faced, were doing something interesting in the Permian that is worth pausing on. They were, slowly and unevenly developing the suite of anatomical features that we associate with mammalian biology. Differentiated teeth for different functions, evidence of more upright posture than the sprawling gait of most reptiles, possible endothermy or at least some degree of metabolic flexibility, and in the more derived forms, evidence of a secondary palate that would have allowed breathing and eating simultaneously. A small change with large implications for sustained aerobic activity and the metabolic rate that supports it. These are not signs of incipient intelligence. They are signs of a lineage moving toward a particular biological organization that would, hundreds of millions of years later, produce the conditions in which intelligence became possible. The Permian therapsids were not on the cusp of building cities. They were on the cusp of becoming the ancestors of the mammals, including eventually the primates, including eventually us. And then the Permian ended, and the therapsids were nearly erased along with everything else, and the survivors started over from almost nothing. What the Permian illustrates, in the context of the Silurian hypothesis, is not a specific candidate lineage for prior civilization. It illustrates the pattern of a lineage developing increasing biological complexity, ecological dominance, and anatomical sophistication over tens of millions of years, and then being reduced to a remnant by a catastrophe that had nothing to do with the trajectory the lineage was on. The catastrophe was geological. It was volcanic. The Siberian Traps, the largest continental flood basalt province known in the geological record, erupted over a period of perhaps 1 million years straddling the Permian-Triassic boundary, releasing volumes of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide that destabilized the global climate in cascading ways that are still being studied and debated. The therapsids did not cause the eruption. They had no influence on it. They were simply in the path of it. The Siberian Traps themselves are worth spending some time with, because they are the closest natural analogue we have to the kind of planetary-scale chemical perturbation that the Silurian hypothesis invokes as a comparison. The eruption lasted, in geological terms, a very short time. The carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide it released produced rapid global warming followed by ocean acidification, followed by widespread anoxia in the marine environment. The sequence of events is complex and the details are still debated, but the broad outline is clear. A pulse of volcanic carbon into the atmosphere destabilized a climate system that had been relatively stable. The destabilization cascaded through the ocean and the terrestrial biosphere, and the result was the extinction of the majority of species on Earth. The geological signature of the Siberian Traps eruption is visible in the rock. It is visible as a carbon isotope excursion. It is visible as elevated mercury concentrations in the sediment. Mercury is a byproduct of large igneous province volcanism and is preserved in marine sediments at the boundary. It is visible as evidence of rapid warming in the oxygen isotope record. It is visible in the disappearance of fossil taxa from the record, abruptly and globally. The eruption happened, the evidence is there. We read it correctly, or at least we read it as volcanic, which is almost certainly correct. Now here is the Silurian hypothesis's sharpest question, applied directly to the Permian-Triassic boundary. The chemical signatures of the Siberian Traps eruption and the chemical signatures of a hypothetical large-scale industrial civilization burning fossil fuels are, in many respects, similar. Both involve rapid carbon release, both produce carbon isotope excursions, both produce warming, both produce ocean acidification. The mercury signature is specific to volcanism and would not be produced by industrial activity, which is one meaningful chemical distinction. But the carbon signal, the warming signal, and the ocean chemistry signal would overlap substantially between the two causes. This does not mean the Permian-Triassic extinction was caused by an industrial civilization. The evidence for the Siberian Traps as the primary driver of the extinction is extensive and internally consistent. The large igneous province is there, physically, as basalt covering an area of roughly 2 million square kilometers of Siberia. The timing aligns with the boundary. The mercury signature confirms volcanic activity. The hypothesis that the extinction was volcanic is not merely an assumption. It is a well-supported scientific conclusion based on multiple, independent lines of evidence that converge on the same cause. What the comparison does illustrate is the broader principle. The chemical language in which civilizational and volcanic activity are written shares enough vocabulary that disambiguation requires very specific, independent evidence that does not exist for any proposed prior civilization. because no prior civilization is currently proposed with enough specificity to generate testable predictions. The Permian world, in its last few million years before the extinction, was not a comfortable place by modern standards, but it was biologically rich and ecologically complex in ways we're only beginning to appreciate fully. The therapsid fauna of the Karoo Basin, in what is now South Africa, is one of the most intensively studied Permian fossil assemblages in the world. The Karoo sediments are ancient river and lake deposits, and they preserve therapsid remains in extraordinary numbers and diversity. Walking through those rocks, which have been eroding out of the South African landscape for millions of years, and which continue to yield new material after more than a century of systematic collection, is to walk through a world that was genuinely alien and genuinely sophisticated in its ecological organisation. A Gorgonopsian moving through the late Permian landscape of what will eventually become South Africa is worth pausing with for a moment. It is large. Some species reach 2 to 3 meters in length, and it is built with a forward-facing stance that is more upright than most of its contemporaries, though not as fully upright as a mammal or a dinosaur. Its skull is long and deep, with enormous canine teeth that project well below the lower jaw when the mouth is closed. It is a predator, the apex predator of its local ecosystem, and it moves with the efficiency of an animal that has been refined by selection pressure over millions of years into a highly effective killing machine. Its sensory world is organised primarily around smell. The olfactory bulbs are large relative to the rest of the brain, and around the detection of movement and vibration through a sensory apparatus that is still being characterised from skull anatomy. The Gorgonopsian does not think in any way we would recognise as thought. It does not plan beyond the immediate horizon of hunger and territory and reproduction. It has no concept of the deep past or the distant future. It does not know that it is the descendant of lineages that stretch back through hundreds of millions of years of evolution, or that its own lineage will be nearly extinguished in a few million years by a volcanic catastrophe on the other side of the world. It moves through its Permian landscape as all organisms do, responding to the present, shaped by the past, indifferent to the future. And yet it is here, fully present in a world of extraordinary biological complexity, ecological richness, and evolutionary dynamism. A world that will be largely erased in what amounts to a geological instant. A world whose detailed biography we know only because the right sediments were deposited in the right basins and survived the right combination of subsequent geological events to bring those sediments to the surface in a form we can study. Most of the Permian world did not survive in the rock. Most of the organisms that lived and died in the Permian are gone without trace, not because they were simple or rare, but because the conditions for fossilization were not met, or because the rock that formed from their remains was subsequently subducted or eroded or metamorphosed beyond recognition. The Karoo Basin is exceptional. The preservation it offers is a gift of specific tectonic and sedimentary circumstances that do not apply to most of the Permian terrestrial record worldwide. And this, finally, is the point that the Permian makes most clearly in the context of everything we have been discussing. The fossil record we have is not a representative sample of the life that existed. It is a sample biased towards certain environments, certain body types, certain mineralogies, certain tectonic settings. The organisms that lived in highland environments, on exposed coastlines, in forests without nearby lakes or rivers, these organisms are systematically underrepresented in the fossil record because their remains were not deposited in the sedimentary environments where preservation is most likely. Their world existed. We simply cannot see it in the rock. If any prior civilization existed anywhere in Earth's deep history, it almost certainly existed in exactly the kinds of environments, terrestrial, complex, ecologically rich, that are most poorly represented in the fossil record. Not in shallow marine basins where preservation is best, not in lowland river floodplains where sediment accumulates rapidly. It would have existed in the places where organisms with the complexity to develop technology tend to live, in varied landscapes with diverse resources, near rivers and coastlines, but not necessarily in them, in the kinds of ecotonal environments where cognitive complexity tends to be selected for in vertebrate lineages. And those are precisely the environments whose fossil record is most fragmentary. The Gorgonopsian moves on through its late Permian afternoon. The sky above it is a deep orange at the horizon, and the air is dry, and the vegetation is sparser than it was 1 million years ago because the climate has been shifting subtly toward aridity. It does not notice the change. The change is too slow for any individual organism to perceive, but it is happening, and in a few million years something much faster and much more total will happen, and the Gorgonopsians' lineage will be among the casualties. What replaces it in the Triassic will be different. Smaller, more generalist, more cautious, starting over. The Middle Triassic is a quieter world than the one that preceded it, but quieter in the way that a landscape is quiet after a fire has passed through it, and the first green shoots are beginning to push up through the ash. The biological communities of the early and Middle Triassic are thin by the standards of what came before and what came after. The reefs have not yet fully rebuilt. The terrestrial vertebrate faunas are still sorting themselves into the ecological roles that the extinction emptied. The forests, to the extent that anything in the early Triassic deserves that word, are dominated by seed ferns and early conifers rather than the vast leucopsid swamps of the Carboniferous or the angiosperm-dominated landscapes that will eventually characterize the Cenozoic. But life is moving. It is always moving, even when it appears to be recovering. The Archosaur lineage that we met at the shoreline in the first part of this documentary is diversifying during the Triassic into forms that will eventually become, on one branch the crocodilians, and on another branch the dinosaurs and ultimately the birds. The marine reptiles, ichthyosaurs, early nothosaurs, the precursors of the plesiosaurs, are filling the ocean niches vacated by the Permian extinction, with extraordinary speed by geological standards, radiating into body plans and ecological strategies within a few million years of the recovery that took the preceding lineages tens of millions of years to develop. The Middle Triassic is also when the first genuinely large dinosaurs appear, if we are careful about what we mean by large. The early dinosaurs of the Middle and Late Triassic are modest by the standards of the Jurassic giants that will follow them. Iraptor, from the Ischigualasto formation of what is now Argentina, was roughly 1 meter long and probably weighed less than 10 kilograms. Herrerasaurus, from the same formation, was larger, perhaps 3 to 4 meters long, but was still a relatively lean and fast predator, rather than the massive sauropod or theropod forms that would come millions of years later. These early dinosaurs were not yet dominant. They shared their world with a diverse assemblage of other archosaurs, with large pseudosuchians, the crocodilian lineage, and with the surviving therapsids, who continued to contribute species to the Triassic fauna even as their diversity declined relative to the archosaurs. What was happening in the oceans during this period is, in some ways, more dramatic than what was happening on land. The marine recovery from the Permian extinction involved the rapid evolution of entirely new reef-building organisms, because the dominant reef builders of the Permian, the rugose and tabulate corals, had gone extinct. The reefs that began forming in the Middle Triassic were built by a different group of corals, the scleractinians, which had either survived the extinction as soft-bodied organisms that left no fossil trace, or had evolved rapidly from surviving relatives in the early Triassic. The scleractinian corals are the corals that build modern reefs. Their appearance in the Triassic is a foundational moment in the history of marine ecosystems, and the reefs they built over the following hundreds of millions of years are among the most biologically complex structures that any organism has ever produced. Reef ecosystems are relevant to the Silurian hypothesis in a specific way that is easy to overlook. Reefs are biological structures of enormous physical scale, built over millions of years by the accumulated skeletal remains of billions of individual organisms. They are preserved in the geological record as limestone, the compressed and cemented remains of carbonate skeletons, and they are among the most durable and extensive biological deposits in the entire stratigraphic column. Ancient reef limestone is found on every continent. It is quarried for building material. It forms mountain ranges. The Dolomites of northern Italy are largely ancient Triassic reef limestone, now uplifted and partially metamorphosed, but still recognizable as the remains of a once living biological community. The contrast between the preservation of reef limestone and the preservation of any hypothetical manufactured structure is stark and instructive. A reef survives because it produces carbonate minerals directly, in volumes so large and over timescales so extended that the geological system absorbs them as a standard component of sedimentary rock. A manufactured structure survives, if at all, as a chemical anomaly in the surrounding rock, a zone of elevated metal concentration, an isotopically unusual carbon layer, a patch of unusually pure silica that might once have been glass. The reef leaves a mountain range. The city leaves, at best, a whisper in the geochemistry. This asymmetry between biological preservation and technological preservation is one of the foundational insights of the Silurian hypothesis, and it is one that the Triassic record illustrates with particular clarity. The Triassic is full of biological evidence: fossil bone beds, trackways, reef limestone, plant compressions, spore and pollen assemblages that allow palynologists to reconstruct entire plant communities from sediment cores. The biological world of the Triassic is accessible to us in considerable detail. The technological world, if any technological world existed in the Triassic which is not being claimed here, would be, by comparison, essentially invisible. There is a specific candidate period within the deep past that the Silurian hypothesis occasionally references in discussions of its most productive testing grounds, and it is worth addressing directly. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which we touched on briefly in an earlier part of this documentary, occurred approximately 56 million years ago. It is considerably more recent than the Triassic, which means the sedimentary record of the PEPM is much better preserved and much more extensively studied than any Triassic equivalent would be. The PEPM involved a rapid and large release of carbon into the atmosphere and ocean. The carbon isotope excursion at the boundary is one of the largest in the Cenozoic record, and it produced a warming event of several degrees Celsius that lasted for approximately 100,000 to 200,000 years before the carbon was drawn back down. The cause of the PM is still debated. The most widely supported hypothesis is that a combination of orbital forcing, changes in Earth's orbit that produced gradual warming, and geological carbon release, possibly from the intrusion of the North Atlantic igneous province into organic-rich sediments, triggered a destabilization of methane hydrate reservoirs on the seafloor, releasing large quantities of isotopically light carbon in a relatively sudden pulse. This is a plausible and well-supported hypothesis, but it is also true that the PETM has characteristics: the speed of the carbon release, the magnitude of the isotope excursion, the global distribution of the warming signal, that fit imperfectly with purely geological mechanisms, and that several research groups have noted the difficulty of fully accounting for the rate of carbon release from volcanic sources alone. None of this means that the PEPM was caused by a prior civilization. The evidence for geological and hydrothermal causes is substantial, but the PEPM is the event that Schmidt and Frank identify as perhaps the best candidate for re-examination under the framework of the Silurian hypothesis, not because it was probably caused by a civilization, but because it is recent enough that the geological record is well preserved, the chemical signals are clearly readable, and if any anomalies existed in the record that departed from purely geological expectations, they would be detectable with current analytical methods. The PEPM is, in this sense, a test case for the hypothesis's methodology. Could we tell the difference, at 56 million years distance, between a geological carbon release and an industrial one? The organisms alive during the PEPM were the early Eocene fauna, a world of early primates, archaic ungulates, early whales still in the process of returning to the sea, birds that had been diversifying since the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction. No organism in the PEPM fauna was remotely close to the cognitive or technological complexity that the hypothesis would require for civilizational activity. The PEPM predates the emergence of any primate lineage with enlarged brains by tens of millions of years. It predates the genus Homo by more than 55 million years. It is, in terms of vertebrate neurological complexity, a world of animals that were sophisticated and ecologically successful, but nowhere near the threshold of technology. So the PTM does not offer a biologically plausible candidate for a prior civilization. What it offers is a methodological proving ground. If the analytical tools applied to PTM sediments can cleanly distinguish between volcanic carbon release and organic carbon release, which they largely can, using mercury as a proxy for volcanic activity, then those same tools might eventually be refined to the point where they could distinguish between volcanic carbon and industrial carbon in older and less well-preserved records. That refinement is not yet complete, but the direction of the research is toward greater chemical specificity, and greater chemical specificity means greater ability to test the hypothesis rigorously. In the warm, shallow sea of the Middle Triassic, an ichthyosaur surfaces to breathe. It has the shape of a large dolphin, though it is not related to any dolphin. It is an archosaur lineage that returned to the sea after the Permian extinction and converged on the streamlined body plan that water selects for in large, fast-swimming predators. It breathes through nostrils set back toward the top of its skull and it takes in the thick Triassic air, richer in carbon dioxide than any air a human would find comfortable. And then it dives again into the warm, slightly acidic water toward the squid-like cephalopods and the schooling fish that form its diet. It does not carry the question with it. The question belongs to us. The ichthyosaur carries only hunger and navigation, and the warm pressure of the water against its flanks. But it is evidence, in its own way, of the principle the hypothesis rests on. The ichthyosaur lineage diversified, dominated marine ecosystems for roughly 160 million years, produced some of the largest marine predators in Earth history, and then went extinct, quietly and without obvious cause, in the early Cretaceous, roughly 90 million years ago. Their extinction was not dramatic. It did not involve an asteroid or a large igneous province. The ichthyosaurs simply declined and disappeared, leaving behind bones in marine sediment and a ghost of their former ecological presence in the food webs that rearranged themselves after they were gone. We know they existed because the conditions for their preservation happened to be met in enough locations that their remains came to us. We know their body plan because some Jurassic specimens preserved not just bone but the outline of soft tissue as a carbon film in the surrounding shale, giving us a silhouette of the living animal. We know something about their diet from stomach contents preserved in a handful of exceptional specimens, and we know their approximate diversity and biogeography from the distribution of their remains in marine sedimentary rocks on several continents. All of that knowledge depends on preservation. It depends on the accident of sedimentation, on the chemical conditions of burial, on the tectonic stability of the basins where their remains were deposited, on the subsequent history of those rocks as the continents moved and the sea levels changed and the mountain ranges rose and eroded. The ichthyosaur fossil record is good by paleontological standards, and yet it is almost certainly a small fraction of the actual diversity and abundance of the lineage during its peak. If the fossil record of a large, diverse and globally distributed group of vertebrates is this incomplete after 90 to 160 million years, the fossil record of any hypothetical terrestrial civilization operating for a far shorter period at much higher intensity would be immeasurably more incomplete, not because civilizational activity is harder to detect in principle, but because civilizational activity produces different kinds of evidence, chemical rather than skeletal, diffuse rather than concentrated, atmospheric rather than sedimentary. And those kinds of evidence degrade differently, and in many cases faster, than bone. The Middle Triassic afternoon is long. The sun, slightly younger and fractionally dimmer than the sun of our own era, moves across a sky that holds no contrail, no satellite, no signal of any kind that a receiver 230 million years in the future could detect as technological. The conifers stand at the edge of the water. The archosaurs move through the understory. The ichthyosaur has dived again. The world is going about the business of being a world, indifferent to questions about what it may or may not have contained before, and what it will or will not be able to show us about itself across the immensity of geological time. The question of what constitutes evidence, and who gets to decide what counts as evidence, is not a question that belongs only to the Silurian hypothesis. It is a question that runs through the entire history of geology as a discipline, an understanding that history briefly, carefully, and helps to place the hypothesis in the right intellectual context. Geology as a formal science is young. The foundational principles that allow geologists to read the rock record as a sequence of events in time were not established until the late 18th and early 19th centuries. James Hutton, a Scottish physician and farmer who spent decades studying the rock exposures of the Scottish lowlands and coastline, articulated the principle of uniformitarianism in 1788, the idea that the geological processes observable in the present are the same processes that have operated throughout Earth history, and that by understanding the present we can read the past. Charles Lyell extended and systematized Hutton's ideas in his Principles of Geology, published in 3 volumes between 1830 and 1833, and the framework he established, deep time, gradual change, present processes as the key to the past, became the foundational framework within which geology has operated ever since. Uniformitarianism is not wrong. It is one of the most productive intellectual frameworks in the history of natural science, and the geological record would be essentially unreadable without it. But it contains an assumption that is worth making explicit. The assumption is that the processes operating in the past were the same processes we observe today. Natural processes, geological processes, biological processes. The framework does not, as originally constructed, include industrial civilizational activity as a geological process, because industrial civilizational activity did not exist when the framework was built, and because the framework was built to explain a record that appeared, at the time, to be fully explicable without invoking it. When geologists encounter a carbon isotope excursion in ancient rock, their interpretive toolkit includes volcanism, ocean anoxia, methane hydrate destabilization, changes in biological productivity, and various diagenetic processes. It does not include, as a standard item in the toolkit, rapid fossil fuel combustion by a technological civilization. And it does not include that item, not because it has been rigorously considered and rejected, but because the question has not been systematically asked within the mainstream geological literature. Schmidt and Frank's 2019 paper is, in a meaningful sense, an invitation to add a new item to the toolkit, or at least to acknowledge that the toolkit might need to be examined for gaps. This is a methodologically conservative position, not a radical one. It does not require believing that a prior civilization existed. It requires only acknowledging that our interpretive frameworks are shaped by our assumptions, and that assumptions should be examined periodically. Science progresses, in part, by expanding the range of hypotheses that are considered testable. The concept of deep time itself, the recognition that Earth is billions of years old rather than thousands, was not intuitive or easily accepted when it was first proposed. The human mind is not naturally calibrated for timescales of millions of years. We experience time in days and seasons and generations. 1,000 years feels remote. 10,000 years feels almost mythological. 100,000 years is beyond the effective range of unassisted human intuition. 1,000,000 years is a number we can write and recite without genuinely grasping what it contains. And 4.5 billion years, the age of the Earth, is a number that the brain handles as an abstraction rather than as a felt duration, because the brain has no frame of reference for it. This failure of intuition has practical consequences for how we think about the Silurian hypothesis. When we say that any evidence of a prior civilization would be erased by geological processes, we are making a claim that requires the intuitive grasp of very long timescales. The city disappears in 1,000 years. The foundations disappear in 100,000. The chemical signature attenuates over millions. The rock itself is recycled over hundreds of millions. Each of those steps requires holding in mind a span of time that exceeds anything in human experience, and the cumulative effect, 4 billion years of geological cycling acting on any hypothetical prior evidence, is genuinely beyond the reach of ordinary intuition. The tool that compensates for this intuitive failure is mathematics, and the relevant mathematics here is not complex. It is the mathematics of exponential decay and geological cycling rates, applied to the persistence of physical and chemical signatures in rock. The half-life concept, familiar from radioactive decay, has analogues in geochemistry. The half-life of certain organic compounds in sediment, the effective diffusion rate of trace metals through porous rock, the timescale over which isotopic ratios in a sediment column are homogenized by diagenetic processes. These are measurable parameters. They are routinely used in geochemistry to assess the reliability of ancient chemical data. And applied to the question of prior civilization detection, they give quantitative answers about what should and should not survive at various time depths. The answers are not encouraging for detectability. At 1 million years, some chemical signatures might persist in well-preserved sediments under ideal conditions. At 10 million years, the window narrows considerably. At 100 million years, the window is very narrow indeed. At 250 million years, the window is, for most chemical signatures, effectively closed. Not because the chemistry is impossible to preserve in principle, but because the probability that any specific deposit has survived the full range of geological processes acting over that time span in an unaltered and readable state is very low. This does not mean the hypothesis is unfalsifiable. It means the hypothesis is very difficult to test at the time depths originally implied by the title of the documentary you're listening to. 200 million years, which is roughly the age of the Middle Triassic, is close to the upper limit of what could plausibly yield a detectable civilizational signal given current analytical methods and our understanding of geological preservation. The more productive testing grounds for the hypothesis, from a purely methodological standpoint, are the more recent periods, the Eocene, the Paleocene, the Late Cretaceous. These periods have better preserved sedimentary records, higher spatial resolution in the data, and organisms that are, at least in some cases, beginning to approach the cognitive complexity that the hypothesis requires. The late Cretaceous in particular is worth a moment's attention. Not as a specific candidate for prior civilization, the cognitive complexity is not there in any documented lineage, but as a window into the preservational environment. The late Cretaceous chalk seas that covered much of what is now northwestern Europe were among the most biologically productive marine environments in Earth history. The chalk itself, the white rock that forms the famous cliffs of Dover, the hills of northern France, the downs of southern England, is made almost entirely of the microscopic calcite plates of single-celled algae called coccolithophores. Billions upon billions of individual organisms, each producing a tiny calcite structure no more than a few micrometers across, accumulated on the seafloor over tens of millions of years and compacted into a rock that is now 30 to 40 meters thick in many places and has been geologically stable enough to survive 66 million years with its internal stratigraphy largely intact. That chalk preserves chemical signals with extraordinary fidelity. The carbon isotope record through the Cretaceous chalk is one of the most detailed in the entire geological column. The oxygen isotope record preserves paleotemperature information with sufficient resolution to reconstruct seasonal cycles in some intervals. The trace element record preserves information about ocean chemistry at a level of detail that allows reconstruction of ancient ocean circulation patterns. The chalk is, in geological terms, an exceptional archive, not complete, not unbiased, but rich and readable in ways that most ancient sediment is not. If a civilizational chemical signal existed in the Cretaceous, the chalk would be among the most likely places to find it. And the chalk has been studied intensively for more than a century by generations of geochemists and paleoceanographers and stratigraphers who have examined its chemistry in extraordinary detail. Nothing in that record has been identified as anomalous in a way that requires a non-geological explanation. The anomalies that exist are explained by volcanism, by changes in ocean circulation, by orbital forcing, by the biological evolution of the coccolithophore communities themselves. The record is full and consistent within a geological framework. That is a meaningful data point. It does not prove the absence of a prior civilization, because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in a record that, however good it is by geological standards, is still incomplete by any absolute standard. But it does mean that if a civilizational signal existed in the Cretaceous chalk, it is either below the detection threshold of current analytical methods, or it has been interpreted as something geological, or it does not exist. All three possibilities remain open. The Cretaceous world that those chalk seas existed within was, in many ways, the most biologically extravagant the planet has ever produced. The dinosaurs were at their peak diversity and ecological dominance. The flowering plants, the angiosperms, had appeared in the early Cretaceous and were by the late Cretaceous spreading into every terrestrial environment on the planet, diversifying into the tens of thousands of species that would eventually form the dominant vegetation of the modern world. The insects that co-evolved with those flowers were diversifying in parallel, producing the extraordinary richness of insect fauna that persists today and that underwrites most terrestrial food webs. The birds were diversifying from their theropod dinosaur ancestors. The marine environment held mosasaurs, large predatory marine reptiles, alongside the last of the plesiosaurs, and a diverse fauna of fish, sharks, ammonites, and the increasingly abundant marine mammals that would inherit the sea after the extinction. Into this world, no organism was carrying anything we would recognize as technology. The most cognitively complex animals of the late Cretaceous were probably some of the larger theropod dinosaurs, perhaps troodontids or dromaeosaurids, which had relatively large brains for their body size and showed evidence of complex social behavior and possibly cooperative hunting. But the gap between the cognitive complexity of even the most neurologically sophisticated non-avian dinosaur and the cognitive complexity required for symbolic thought, language, and technology is vast, and the fossil record gives no indication that any late Cretaceous lineage was crossing or approaching that gap. The world does not aim at intelligence. It produces intelligence in the same accidental, contingent way it produces everything else, through the accumulation of small changes under selection pressure in environments that happen to select for the specific combination of traits that eventually, in one particular lineage on one particular continent in one particular geological epoch, crossed the threshold into symbolic thought and technology. The improbability of that crossing is real, and its improbability makes the Silurian hypothesis not more likely, but more interesting as a question. Because if the crossing is improbable, the hypothesis is probably wrong, and that is exactly the kind of hypothesis that is worth examining carefully, because carefully examined improbable hypotheses either confirm our frameworks or, occasionally, expand them. A troodontid moves through the late Cretaceous underbrush of what will eventually become Montana. It is small, perhaps 1 meter tall at the hip, 2 meters in total length, with large forward-facing eyes that give it binocular vision and good depth perception, the kind of visual system that is most useful for precise manipulation and tracking of fast-moving objects. It has a brain that is, relative to its body size, among the largest of any non-avian dinosaur. It moves with a quick, bird-like economy of motion, head tilted slightly to the side, tracking something in the undergrowth with a focused attention that, in a mammal, we would readily call intelligence. It finds what it is looking for, it catches it and eats it, and moves on. The Cretaceous afternoon continues around it, thick with insect sound, warm and humid under a sky that holds more carbon dioxide than any sky a human being has ever breathed under. The troodontid does not know what it is. It does not know where it is in time. It does not know that in a few million years, an asteroid approximately 10 kilometers in diameter will strike the shallow sea of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, releasing energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons, and that the consequence of that impact will include the extinction of every non-avian dinosaur on Earth, including every troodontid in every underbrush on every continent. It simply moves. That is what life does. It moves through the present, shaped entirely by the past, entirely ignorant of the future, and entirely dependent on conditions that can change, without warning, on geological timescales that no organism has the capacity to anticipate. The asteroid that ended the Cretaceous left a mark on the geological record that is visible on every continent. It is called the KP boundary, from the German abbreviation for Cretaceous Paleogene, and it appears in the rock as a thin layer of clay enriched in iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust but abundant in certain types of asteroid. Along with shocked quartz, tiny glass spherules formed by the enormous heat and pressure of the impact, and a sharp discontinuity in the fossil pollen and spore record that reflects the sudden collapse of terrestrial plant communities. The layer is typically only a centimetre or two thick, sometimes less. 66 million years of geological time, compressed into a few millimetres of grey clay. That thin layer is one of the most studied horizons in all of stratigraphy. It has been sampled from hundreds of sites on 6 continents and in marine cores from the deep ocean. Its chemistry is internally consistent across the globe, which is how we know the iridium came from a single extraterrestrial source, rather than from diffuse volcanic activity. The shocked quartz and the glass spherules confirm a high-energy impact event. The pollen and spore record above the boundary reflects the recovery of plant communities over the following thousands to tens of thousands of years. The boundary is real, it is global, and it is read the same way by every geologist who examines it regardless of where in the world they are working. The KP boundary matters to the Silurian hypothesis for a specific reason. It is an example of a global event that left a thin but globally consistent chemical signature in the sedimentary record. A single impact 66 million years ago produced a signal that we can detect today in rocks from Montana, from Spain, from New Zealand, from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. The signal is subtle, a centimetre of iridium-enriched clay, but it is unambiguous. And the reason it is unambiguous is that iridium is genuinely anomalous in Earth's crustal rocks, making any elevated concentration stand out against the background in a way that demands explanation. The question the KPG boundary raises for the Silurian hypothesis is this: if a single impact event can leave a globally detectable chemical signal after 66 million years, what kind of global civilizational activity would be required to leave a comparable signal? And would the signal of civilizational activity be as chemically distinctive as an iridium anomaly? Or would it blend into the background of natural geological processes in a way that the iridium does not? The honest answer is that civilizational chemical signals are less distinctive than iridium anomalies. Iridium is genuinely rare in crustal rocks, which means that any elevated concentration stands out with statistical clarity against the background. Carbon isotope excursions, metal concentration anomalies, and organic geochemical signatures, the categories of signal that civilizational activity would produce, all have natural analogues that complicate the interpretation. They are not background-free signals the way iridium is. They exist on a continuum with naturally produced variations, and distinguishing the anthropogenic from the natural requires additional lines of evidence that may or may not be available in ancient sediment. This is, in a precise technical sense, the core difficulty of the Silurian hypothesis as a testable scientific proposition. It is not that the hypothesis is incoherent, it is that the signals it predicts are not chemically unique to their proposed cause. A carbon isotope excursion could be civilizational or volcanic. An elevated metal concentration could be industrial or hydrothermal. The hypothesis would become more robustly testable if a chemical signature could be identified that was specifically produced by industrial civilization and not by any natural geological or biological process. The search for such a signature is, in principle, a productive direction for research. One candidate that has been discussed in the literature cautiously is the signature of certain synthetic chemical compounds that have no natural analogue, chlorofluorocarbons, certain industrial polymers, specific categories of organochlorine compounds. These molecules are not produced by any geological or biological process that operated before the industrial era. If any of them persisted in the sedimentary record in an ancient rock layer, their presence would be, in principle, unambiguous evidence of industrial chemistry at that point in geological time. The difficulty is that most of these compounds are not chemically stable over very long timescales. They decompose through photolysis, hydrolysis, and microbial activity. The persistence of any specific synthetic compound over millions of years in an unaltered form is, with current knowledge, considered very unlikely. But the geological record has produced surprises in organic geochemistry before. The detection of biomarkers, the molecular fossils of ancient biological compounds, including sterones, hopones, and various classes of organic molecules produced by specific types of organisms, has pushed back the chemical record of life on Earth far beyond what was previously thought possible. Biomarkers have been identified in rocks more than 1 billion years old in some cases, though with increasing uncertainty about their primary origin as the age increases. If biological organic molecules can persist for hundreds of millions or even billions of years under the right geochemical conditions, it is at least worth asking whether any class of synthetic organic molecule might also persist in some form over comparable timescales. This is genuinely frontier science, not established, not confirmed, a direction of inquiry rather than a conclusion. The honest position is that we do not currently know whether any synthetic organic compound could persist in ancient rock in a form that would be identifiable as synthetic rather than natural. The research required to answer that question involves synthesizing candidate compounds, subjecting them to laboratory simulations of sedimentary burial conditions, and tracking their degradation products over time. Some of that research is ongoing in organic geochemistry laboratories that are primarily focused on petroleum geochemistry and the fate of organic matter in sedimentary basins. The question of synthetic compound persistence is not their primary focus, but the tools they are developing are directly relevant to it. Outside the chemistry, there is another category of evidence that the Silurian hypothesis touches on, and it is one that is more accessible to intuition than trace geochemistry. It is the question of what happens to the biosphere when a technologically active civilization exists within it. Not just the chemical footprint of industrial activity, but the biological footprint. The changes to species distributions, to ecological communities, to the evolutionary pressures on wild organisms that a technological civilization exerts, simply by existing and expanding across the landscape. A civilization that spreads across continents will, as a consequence of that spread, drive species to extinction, introduce organisms to new environments where they did not previously exist, alter vegetation communities, modify rivers and coastlines, and in general reshape the biological geography of the planet in ways that have no natural analogue at the same spatial and temporal scale. These changes leave marks in the fossil record. The fossil record of the Pleistocene and Holocene, the period over which our own civilization has expanded, shows a distinct pattern of megafaunal extinction that tracks the spread of human populations across the globe. As humans arrived in Australia, the large marsupials disappeared. As humans crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge, the mammoths and giant ground sloths and horses and camels of the New World went extinct within a few thousand years. The pattern is not perfect. Climate change contributed to some of these extinctions, but the correlation between human arrival and megafaunal collapse is strong enough that most researchers accept hunting pressure as a significant or primary driver. That pattern, rapid geographically spreading megafaunal extinction, correlated with a specific demographic event, might be detectable in the fossil record of an ancient period if it existed. It would appear as a wave of extinction moving across a continent over a geologically brief period, affecting large-bodied species preferentially, without an obvious climatic or volcanic cause at the same time. The detection of such a pattern would not prove technological civilization. Rapid climate change can also drive megafaunal extinction, as the Pleistocene glacial cycles demonstrate. But it would be a biological anomaly worth examining carefully alongside the chemical record. No such pattern has been identified in any pre-Pleistocene geological period. The mass extinctions we know of, the 5 great ones plus numerous smaller events, are all associated with identifiable geological causes: volcanism, impact, rapid climate change, ocean anoxia. None of them shows the specific spatial pattern of a geographically spreading extinction front that would suggest a mobile technological agent moving through a landscape. This is evidence against the hypothesis, honestly stated. It is not conclusive evidence. The fossil record may simply lack the spatial resolution to detect such a pattern in ancient periods, but it is a genuine constraint. The Jurassic world that followed the Triassic is, in many respects, the most visually dramatic period in Earth history, by the standards of popular imagination. It is the age of the sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed giant herbivores that were, by body mass, the largest land animals that have ever lived. Argentinosaurus, from the middle to late Cretaceous of South America, may have reached a body mass of 70 to 80 metric tons, which exceeds any other terrestrial animal in the fossil record. Patagotitan maiorum, from a slightly later period, was similar in scale. These animals moved through Jurassic and Cretaceous forests on legs like pillars, eating vegetation in quantities that no modern herbivore approaches, and their bones, when they died, were large enough and dense enough to fossilize with relative reliability in the right depositional environment. The sauropods are an extreme example of one of the things that life does when it has sufficient time, stable conditions, and the right ecological context. It explores the boundaries of what is physically possible within the constraints of biological organization. Body size in terrestrial vertebrates is constrained by bone strength, by the efficiency of the circulatory system, by the energetics of locomotion. The sauropods pushed those constraints to their apparent limit, and they did so through a combination of skeletal architecture, pneumatized vertebrae, hollowed by air sacs connected to the respiratory system, and metabolic strategy that is still being debated by paleontologists. The point is not that the sauropods were intelligent, or that they were on any trajectory toward technology. They were not. They were extreme specialists in large-body herbivory, and their specialization left them vulnerable to the catastrophic perturbation that ended the Cretaceous. The point is that 165 million years of dinosaur dominance produced an enormous diversity of form and ecological strategy, explored the physical parameter space of terrestrial vertebrate biology more thoroughly than any subsequent lineage has done, and left a fossil record that, while rich by paleontological standards, still represents only a fraction of the actual diversity that existed. What we cannot see in the dinosaur fossil record is what we cannot see in any fossil record: the behavior, the social organization, the cognitive life, the ecological relationships that were never mineralized and never buried and never preserved. The dinosaurs were not simple animals. Their biology was complex, their ecology was sophisticated, and their behavioral repertoire was almost certainly richer than the bones alone can tell us. But the bones are what we have, and the bones, for all their richness, do not and cannot carry the full weight of what it was to be a dinosaur in a Jurassic forest or a Cretaceous floodplain. That irreducible incompleteness of the fossil record, not as a failure of science but as a fundamental property of the geological archive, is the ground on which the Silurian hypothesis stands, not claiming that the record contains hidden evidence of prior civilization, claiming that the record has limits and that those limits are real and quantifiable, and should be acknowledged explicitly when we make confident statements about what has and has not existed on this planet across the full span of geological time. A long Jurassic afternoon settles over a floodplain in what will eventually be the Morrison Formation of the American West. The light is warm and amber through a haze of dust raised by a passing herd of Camarasaurus. The sound is enormous, not loud in the way a machine is loud, but deep and resonant. The sound of animals, each weighing 20 metric tons, moving in loose association across a landscape of cycads and tree ferns and the first primitive angiosperms just beginning to appear at the margins of the waterways. The ground vibrates faintly with each step. The air smells of dust and vegetation, and faintly the river nearby. Nothing in this scene carries a question about its own nature or its own history. The animals move and breathe and eat, and the afternoon moves around them, and the geological time moves beneath them, carrying everything slowly forward toward a future that none of them will recognize and none of them need to. There is a specific way in which the Silurian hypothesis changes how you look at the world, not by making you believe something new, but by making you notice the assumptions that were already there. The assumption that the geological record is a complete enough archive to confidently rule out prior civilizations. The assumption that our interpretive frameworks for ancient chemistry are calibrated broadly enough to catch signals they were not designed to look for. The assumption that the absence of recognized evidence is equivalent to the absence of the thing the evidence would indicate. These are not unreasonable assumptions. In many contexts they are productive and well supported. But they are assumptions, and the Silurian hypothesis is, at its core, a methodological invitation to examine them. The final question worth sitting with is not whether a prior civilization existed. The probability, given everything we know about evolutionary biology, geological preservation, and the specific history of complex life on Earth, is low. Mainstream science is right to treat it as a low probability proposition. But low probability is not zero probability, and zero probability is the implicit claim that confident dismissal requires. The distinction between low and zero matters, especially in science, because the history of science is partly a history of low probability hypotheses that turned out to be correct, and the mechanism by which they turned out to be correct was almost always the same. Someone asked the question rigorously instead of dismissing it intuitively. The Earth itself is 4.5 billion years old. Complex multicellular animal life has existed for something in the range of 540 million years, roughly 12% of the planet's total age. Technological civilization, as we know it, has existed for perhaps 200 years if we measure from the Industrial Revolution, or perhaps 10,000 years if we measure from the first agricultural settlements, or perhaps 300,000 years if we measure from the first anatomically modern humans. Any of those measures is, in geological terms, an instant. Our civilization is new. Its footprint, while globally significant in terms of ongoing processes, is geologically thin. 200 years of industrial civilization will leave, in the rock record, a layer. A thin, chemically anomalous layer enriched in certain metals, carrying a carbon isotope excursion, bearing traces of synthetic organic compounds that no natural process ever produced. Above and below that layer, the chemistry of normal background geological processes. The layer itself may be, in places, only a centimetre thick. It will be globally distributed, because the atmosphere and ocean distribute chemical signals globally on timescales of decades to centuries. It will be recognisable to any geochemist who examines the right sedimentary section with the right analytical tools as something that requires explanation. Whether it will still be recognisable in 10 million years is uncertain. Whether it will be recognisable in 100 million years is doubtful. Whether it will be recognisable in 250 million years is, for most chemical signatures, effectively impossible to affirm with confidence. The geological processes that will act on the rock containing our civilization's signature over the next 250 million years, subduction, metamorphism, erosion, diagenesis, tectonic cycling, will act on it in ways we can model statistically but cannot predict specifically. Some of the rock will survive, most will not, and the rock that survives will carry only the most durable remnants of the chemical signal, already attenuated and potentially misreadable by whatever interpretive framework exists to examine it. This is our own future in the geological record. Not the cities, not the roads, not the satellites, not the literature or the music or the mathematics, the chemistry. A thin layer of chemistry and rock, globally distributed, anomalous enough to notice if the interpretive framework is broad enough to catch it, potentially invisible if it is not. 200 million years from now, if anything exists that is capable of reading the rock record, and that is itself a genuinely open question, since 200 million years of evolution will produce organisms as different from us as we are from the Triassic Archosaur at the tideline, the layer that corresponds to our civilization will be ancient. It will be as old to those hypothetical future observers as the Triassic is to us. The cities will be unrecognizable. The biology of our species, if any lineage descended from us persists, will be transformed beyond recognition by 200 million years of evolution. The geography of the continents will be different. The Atlantic Ocean will be wider, or may have begun to close again as the tectonic cycle continues. Africa will have fully collided with Europe. The Pacific will be smaller. The climate will have passed through cycles we cannot predict in detail. And in the rock, somewhere, a thin grey layer with anomalous carbon isotopes, and elevated heavy metal concentrations, and perhaps a few molecular remnants of synthetic chemistry. That is what we leave behind, at geological timescales. That is what 200 years of the most technologically intensive civilization in the known history of the planet reduces to when viewed through the lens of deep time. The Silurian hypothesis asks us to hold that image in mind and then ask, if we leave only that, what would a civilization considerably older than ours, or considerably different from ours, leave? A civilization that burned different fuels, or no fuels at all, but processed materials in other ways. A civilization that existed for a shorter period but at higher intensity. A civilization that existed for a much longer period but at lower intensity. The chemical signatures would differ in magnitude and composition, but the fundamental problem remains. At sufficient time depth, the signal attenuates into the noise, and the noise is generated by geological processes that produce chemically similar signatures through entirely natural mechanisms. The early Triassic shore where we began this documentary is still there, in the rock. The sediment that formed from that grey Triassic mud is now a shale somewhere, its bedding planes compressed and its original texture modified by 250 million years of burial and partial diagenesis, but its chemical composition still carrying, in attenuated form, the record of the chemistry that was present when it was deposited. The Archosaur whose footprints were erased by the next wave has no representation in that rock. The Archosaur existed, moved, ate, breathed, and left no trace in the geological record because the conditions for trace preservation were not met at that particular location on that particular morning. Most things leave no trace. Most organisms, most events, most moments. The geological record preserves a small fraction of what happened, biased in specific and partially understood ways towards certain environments, certain chemistries, certain body types, certain timescales. The fraction it preserves is real and valuable, and tells us an extraordinary amount about the history of this planet. But the fraction it does not preserve is vastly larger, and the history contained in that unpreserved fraction is, by definition, inaccessible to us. The Silurian hypothesis lives in that inaccessible fraction. Not comfortably, and not with certainty, but legitimately. It is not claiming that the unpreserved fraction contains evidence of prior civilization. It is claiming that the unpreserved fraction is large enough, and the geological processes that determine what is and is not preserved are indiscriminate enough, that the non-detection of prior civilization in the rock record is not the same as the absence of prior civilization. These are different claims. The first is speculative, the second is stratigraphically sound. Sitting with that distinction between non-detection and absence is the intellectual position the hypothesis invites. It is not a comfortable position if you prefer clean answers. It is a productive position if you are interested in the actual limits of what can be known from the geological record, and in what those limits mean for the confidence with which we make statements about the deep past. The stromatolites at the Triassic shoreline are still growing. They will be growing long after the Archosaur is gone, long after the last therapsid has become a mammal, long after the first dinosaur has evolved and radiated and gone extinct. They will be growing through the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, in the shallow coastal waters of various configurations of continent and sea, because they have been growing since the Archean, since before complex multicellular life existed, since before the chemistry of the ocean had been transformed by the first photosynthetic organisms releasing oxygen into an atmosphere that previously held almost none. The stromatolites are older than any question we can ask about prior civilizations. They predate the very conditions that make complex animal life possible, and they are a kind of answer, in themselves, to the question of deep time and geological preservation, not because they contain evidence of anything other than microbial life, but because their 3 billion year continuity in the fossil record, from the Archean stromatolites of the Pilbara region of Western Australia, among the oldest macroscopic biosignatures known, to the living stromatolites of Shark Bay in the same country, demonstrates that some types of evidence do persist across geological timescales. Biological evidence built of carbonate minerals produced in environments favourable to preservation, in volumes large enough that even catastrophic losses leave abundant survivors. What persists is what is built in ways that geology can accommodate. The stromatolite persists because it is made of the same minerals the rock is made of, added in quantities the sedimentary system absorbs without disruption, over timescales that match the pace of geological change. It is, in this sense, a geological object that happens to be biological, rather than a biological object that happens to be in geology. That compatibility with the geological system is what allows it to survive. A civilization's physical outputs, its buildings, its roads, its manufactured objects, are not compatible with the geological system in that way. They are made of materials foreign to the sedimentary environment, in forms that the geological system reads as disruptions to be corrected, at timescales too short for the geological system to absorb gradually. The geological system corrects those disruptions. It dissolves the foreign materials, redistributes the anomalous concentrations, re-equilibrates the isotopic ratios, until the record of the disruption is reduced to the faintest chemical echo of its former self. That echo may or may not be detectable. That is the honest final position of the Silurian hypothesis. May or may not yes, not no, may or may not, depending on the specific chemistry of the civilization, the specific depositional environment of the sediment that formed during its existence, the specific tectonic history of the basin where those sediments accumulated, and the specific analytical methods available to whoever eventually examines the rock. We do not know what ruled Earth 200 million years ago beyond what the fossil record tells us. The fossil record tells us archosaurs and early dinosaurs and marine reptiles and recovering ecosystems and thin forests of conifers and seed ferns. It does not tell us, and cannot tell us with certainty, whether those were the only things present. The question of whether something else was present, something that left only a chemical whisper in the rock that we have not yet thought to read as what it might be, is not answered by the fossil record. It is only bounded by it, and bounding a question is not the same as answering it. That distinction is where the Silurian hypothesis lives, and it is a legitimate place to live as long as it is inhabited honestly, with the appropriate calibration of probability, and without the certainty that the evidence does not yet support in either direction. The grey Triassic shore at the beginning of this documentary is now somewhere beneath our feet, compressed into rock, carrying whatever it carries from the morning 250 million years ago, when the archosaur moved through the mud at the tide line, and the stromatolites grew, and the warm, sulphurous wave came in and erased whatever prints had been left there. We cannot go back. We can only read what survives, and reading what survives honestly, knowing its limits, knowing its biases, knowing what it can and cannot tell us, is the work that the Silurian hypothesis, at its best, invites geology to do more carefully. If you have made it this far into the night, let that be the last thought before sleep. The rock beneath you is a record, partial and biased and incomplete, of everything that has happened on this planet for 4.5 billion years. It is the best record we have. It is a remarkable record, and it has limits that we are still, slowly and carefully, learning to see. If this documentary has given you something to think about, the channel continues with other explorations of deep time and the geological history of this planet. There is more to find here, in the same steady pace, for the same kind of listening. Rest well.